Hey everyone, welcome back. It's another beautiful day in the woods here, and I wanted to get back to a more casual sort of video rather than the scripted kind I did with Piggy. And today we're going to be talking about Ralph. Now, Ralph is the protagonist of Lord of the Flies, and he really is quite an interesting protagonist because he's so complex in that the way that Golding describes him, he's described as this natural born leader in not just the way he looks, but also the way he carries himself. But he does certain things that makes you question whether or not he actually is a good leader. And then by the end of the story, Golding tells us whether or not he is. And we're going to talk about that today. So to begin with, when Ralph is first talking to Piggy and they're swimming in the lagoon in chapter 1, Ralph mentions how his father is a naval officer. And he just says very casually, he says, "My father's going to rescue us. I'm not worried about being stranded on this island for too long." Piggy asks him, "How will your father find us?" Specifically, Piggy asks him, "How does he know we're here?" He actually asks him twice. He says it again. How does he know we're here? The next line the narrator gives us is pretty interesting. It says, "Because," thought Ralph. Because. So he's got this very immature, naive optimism at the start of the book. He's not worried about being stranded. He's not really worried about much at all. He just assumes that his father's going to rescue them all because he will know where they are since his father's in the Navy. But when Piggy tries to bring logic into the conversation, Ralph doesn't have an answer because Ralph isn't thinking logically at that point. Now, as the story goes on, Ralph starts to lose that naivety, but really what makes it almost tragic is that it's a little too late. That's why some people do refer to Ralph as a tragic hero. Now, a lot of people, I'd say most people probably would disagree with that fact. They would say that he's not a tragic hero. A tragic hero is a very specific term in English literature, and usually it refers to the protagonist having some sort of flaw, some kind of fatal flaw that they just can't get over. And by the end of the story, they meet their demise or they meet tragedy because of that flaw. Now, depending on how you interpret the ending, I do believe that this term can apply to Ralph. So like I said, Ralph does start as a naively optimistic character, and he's naive in other ways too. He's too trusting of the other boys. He lets Jack and the Savages get away with too much without correcting them. Before we really dive into all of those things, I do want to read you the descriptions of Ralph as they are in the book. After Ralph blows the conch and calls all of the boys together, we get a really good description of Ralph and what sets him apart from the other boys. Because at this moment, when Jack joins their group, they are trying to vote on who's going to be chief or who's going to be the leader of them. And obviously Jack wants to be chief. He's the head of the choir boys, and he definitely has an ego. So he wants to be the leader. But listen to what the narrator says about Ralph. "There was a stillness about Ralph as he sat that marked him out. There was his size and attractive appearance, and most obscurely, yet most powerfully, there was the conch. The being that had blown that had sat, waiting for them on the platform, with the delicate thing balanced on his knees, was set apart." So really it's the three things that kind of make him into this natural leader. One, he has his physical description. He just looks like a leader. Number two, he has the conch. And the conch, again, is a symbol of order and civility, but it also is the thing that called them together. It binds the group together. It brings order out of chaos, so to speak. And so he is the holder of the conch. The third thing that the narrator describes Ralph as is that he's just sitting there watching everybody. Where all the other kids are kind of, making noise, moving around, Ralph is just sitting there very patiently and still. And sometimes stillness amongst chaos stands out among the rest, and that's the case with Ralph. So those are the three things about him that set him apart as leader. And so they vote him as chief. And Jack is pretty bummed about that, but we're going to get more into that in the character analysis video of Jack. For the first part of the book, Ralph often argues with Jack and the hunters because he's really frustrated that him and Simon and sometimes Piggy are building the shelters because all of the other kids are off playing, swimming, eating, doing whatever, and they're not really being serious about building shelter on the beach. So Ralph expresses this frustration to Jack, but there is no consequence, there is no punishment whenever Jack steps out of line and doesn't do what he's supposed to do. Ralph tries to take the high road, and because of that, that ultimately leads to the downfall of their civilization. Now, by the time that Simon is killed and the savages have stolen Piggy's glasses, and Ralph and Piggy and Sam and Eric go to Castle Rock to confront Jack and his tribe, Ralph has a moment, and it's near the bottom of page 160, where his character really does show a lot of growth. Remember, I talked about how he started as naively hopeful or naively optimistic. And again, it's that naivety that is kind of like his tragic flaw. By the time we get to the bottom of page 160, Ralph says this to Jack and the group. "Don't you understand, you painted fools? Sam, Eric, Piggy, and me. We aren't enough. We tried to keep the fire going. We couldn't. And then you, playing at hunting." Even though it's a really small moment, it's very important because it does show that he realizes now that they're not going to just be rescued, that they have to actually work together. And admitting that you're not enough to do something, that's a big thing to admit. It's hard for a lot of people to admit this kind of thing, that you aren't enough. Sometimes you really aren't, and you need the help of others. And so that's what Ralph admits in this section. As you know, if you read the book, watched the movie, or watched my previous video about Piggy, you know that Piggy gets killed. And it's a really brutal, violent way that they kill him. They push the boulder on top of him. And this means that Ralph is totally alone in the final chapter of the novel. A couple of interesting things happen in the final chapter of the novel that really show his growth, but also show that he's getting over this naive, immature mentality that he's had. And I think the most symbolic part is when he confronts or discovers the Lord of the Flies. When he finds the pig head on a stick, it's turned into this skull. All of the flesh has completely disintegrated or been eaten off by bugs and animals. So now it's just this pure white bone standing on this stick. And the book says this: "The skull regarded Ralph like one who knows all the answers and won't tell. A sick fear and rage swept him. Fiercely, he hit out at the filthy thing in front of him that bobbed like a toy and came back, still grinning into his face, so that he lashed and cried out in loathing. Then he was licking his bruised knuckles and looking at the bare stick, while the skull lay in two pieces, its grin now 6 feet across. He wrenched the quivering stick from the crack and held it as a spear between him and the white pieces." The reason why this part is so important is because it symbolizes the lesson that Ralph learns at the very end of the novel on the final page, which I'll read in a second. But when Ralph learns about the darkness of man's heart, this moment symbolically shows that he can no longer take the high road. He can no longer be naive and hopeful and optimistic in this circumstance. He has to confront the darkness within his own heart. That's what that scene is all about when he actually sees the Lord of the Flies. He has to confront the darkness in his own heart and use it to survive. That's what he does, because after he breaks the skull off the stick, he takes the stick, and it's sharpened at both ends, if you remember, and he uses that as a defensive weapon for the remainder of the novel, which is really only several pages. Finally, on the last page here, when the naval officer does arrive, right as Ralph is about to be murdered by these savage boys, the naval officer asks, "Who's boss here?" And Ralph responds, "I am." And the narrator says he responds loudly. There is no hesitation. There is no weakness there. He declares that he is boss. This says a lot, because at this point in the novel, Jack has taken over the island. He's in charge of the tribe, and he's declared himself chief, just as everybody else has. Even the narrator has declared Jack as chief. But in this moment, Ralph says that he's the one in charge. So not only does this show that he's a true leader, it also shows that he's willing to take responsibility for everything that's gone down. The death of Simon, the death of Piggy, the death of the boy with the mulberry birthmark near the beginning of the story. He takes responsibility. That's what a true leader does. What makes it tragic is that this lesson was learned too late. If Ralph could have learned this lesson earlier in the novel, Simon wouldn't have been murdered, Piggy wouldn't have been murdered, there wouldn't have been this complete upheaval of their civilization into complete savagery. The lesson comes a little too late, and that's why I believe this is an example of a tragic hero. Finally, at the end of the novel, we get this great line about what Ralph has learned, and it says this: Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, and the fall through the air of the true wise friend called Piggy. What makes this tragic is that he hadn't learned this lesson earlier. Like I said before, if he did learn this lesson earlier, he could have prevented the death of his friends. And that's what is, again, tragic about this, is that not only has he learned the lesson, but now he realizes that if he had learned it sooner, all of this would have been avoided. So do you agree or disagree with that analysis? English literature, when we study it, it's not like math, it's not like science, it's not a binary medium. It's much more fluid than that. Yes, there are times when things are correct or wrong, especially when it comes to grammar and spelling and whatnot. But when we're analyzing symbols and characters, it's really up to your interpretation. So my interpretation, again, is that Ralph is a tragic hero. And because he fails to learn that lesson, that's what makes it a tragedy. He doesn't die in the end, but he also doesn't succeed. If you have a question or a comment, you can leave it below. And be sure to check out the analysis I did of Piggy, as well as the full book summary I did of Lord of the Flies. And be sure to check out the next video where we do a deep dive on Infinite Jest. Thanks for watching.